Welcome back to Higher Ground. This is, yes, it's Kathleen, ringmaster of Higher Ground at B-Sides Las Vegas. So happy to be doing summer camp at home this year where I can kick back and really enjoy time to understand what's going on in various different career tracks. So we've always talked about what security is, how to go about getting your degrees and your certificates. But then there is so much more in our life that is impacted by security. And what more impact are we going to feel than finance? How are we impacted by our credit cards, our banks, our financial institutions that we get our mortgages from? What are all of these components and what is the impact of security on them? That opens up the door for so many different security careers. So we have today a panel of folks that are well known in the community. Some are well known and some are people who we have not heard from before. So I'm really excited to hear their voices talking about how they crafted their finance career, what they think is important, and some tips if you are interested in having a security career in the finance industry. This is Kathleen Smith. Yes, it's Kathleen here at Higher Ground at B-Sides Las Vegas virtual. Every time that we're part of Higher Ground, we really explore the various different career options that are available within our industry. And some of the great things that we have in our industry are people who have been able to delve deeper into specific industries. We've done healthcare, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about finance security and what it is to be part of that security community. So I'd really like to have all of my panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to delve deeper into their backgrounds and how they develop their career path. So Alyssa, would you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Alyssa Miller. I am the Business Information Security Officer for S&P Global Ratings.
Great. Mamani?
Hi, my name is Mamani Older. I am a director at Security Risk Advisors.
Brandon?
Hey everyone, I'm Brandon. I'm a security solutions architect at Amazon Web Services.
And Peter, our longtime career coach at B-Sides Las Vegas Higher Ground.
Thanks. Peter Keenan, I'm a Chief Information Security Officer at Lazard.
Wonderful. So as you can see, we have some really great information security, finance security professionals as part of our panel today, and I'd really like to have each one of them sort of delve a little bit deeper into their backgrounds and how they came to the career that they are at right now. So Brandon, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I actually started out my career at PwC. It was PricewaterhouseCoopers at the time, and I was a consultant there, actually working with Peter and Mamani many years ago, and we were offering consulting services to help financial services companies, particularly mostly the Fortune 500 type firms, really improve and use improve their security and use technology more effectively. So it was a lot of consulting, a lot of technical consulting work. As I kind of progressed through my career there, I was shifting a little bit from more of that technical assessment work more towards overall program design and program effectiveness. And that's where I really got my start with helping organizations stand up security programs. So since then I left and I worked at a variety of different firms, JP Morgan. I worked at a number of different startups across New York, both in the healthcare, health tech sectors, as well as media and finance as well. Ultimately, I landed at my role here at AWS, helping our financial services customers really migrate and meet their security challenges as they're moving into the cloud, which is a huge challenge that we're seeing across the board for our organizations within this industry. So it's been a pretty exciting time.
And that's what I'm really liking, that as people get more involved into specializing their information security, that the opportunities seem to open up more. Alyssa, you want to tell us more about your background?
Sure. So I started pretty much my career path in financial services. When I was 19, I was enrolled in a computer science program at Marquette University. And this was .com era, so everybody was kind of hiring programmers if you could do any form of programming at all. They needed you, and it didn't matter if you had a degree. So at 19, I started working for a local company here in Wisconsin. At the time, it was called M&I Data Services, and it was a subsidiary of M&I Bank. And I started as a programmer. I spent 9 years there before one of the security managers reached out to me and asked if I wanted to join their security test team as a pen tester. And by this point, we were called Metavante, and it was one of those things where I was, sure, I didn't know anything about pen testing, but she was confident that I could figure it out, and so I joined that team. Ended up leading that team through our merger with FIS, which is a name that probably a lot of people recognize today in the financial services space. So that merger took us from a company of 5,000 to a company of 35,000. And, here I was sitting as the leader of not only their security testing, but the complete vulnerability management program for that entire organization. But after 15 years of seeing financial services, I wanted to get to know what the rest of the world was doing. So I got into consulting. I worked for a number of consulting organizations. I started off at BTINS, then went to Fishnet, and got to see some healthcare, some other things. But then after Fishnet merged with Accuvant and they became Optiv, I moved on and joined Aspect Security, managing their program services practice. So Aspect Security was focused on application security, and that program services practice was really focused on helping organizations build a complete program around application security. So through the fun turn of events, I ended up working with a lot of financial services customers again. It was my sweet spot anyway, but it was working with organizations like BNP Paribas or the FRB, the Federal Reserve, organizations like that, and really doing a lot of getting back into that financial services space. Through another couple twists and turns, through a VAR, through a product organization, I ultimately find myself now at S&P Global as the BISO directing security strategy for their ratings division, which is kind of a return home for me. After spending nearly a decade in consulting, I'm now back to, again, a little bit different flavor of financial services, less banking, more, obviously, I work in the credit rating agency side of it. And of course, most people recognize S&P as the S&P 500 or Dow Jones Industrial Indexes that we manage. So that's where I find myself today. It's been kind of a crazy serendipitous road.
That sounds great. I think that's what a lot of people need to understand when you're really building your career strategy, is that there is not necessarily the straight ladder, that I like to call it more the jungle gym, and you have to be able to assess the opportunities and risks at each different level. What is your personal and professional opportunities and risk, and what are your professional opportunities and risks? And I think that's why I wanted to share with many people these various different career paths, because all of us have had to make an assessment as to what our next steps are. And there really is no true wrong answer. You are going to learn something at each step. It's just how you're going to take that gift of failure or a problem and turn it into your next opportunity. Mamani, how about a little bit about your background and your sort of career path?
Sure, and you kind of set the stage for, how you kind of assess opportunities. So Brendan already mentioned we worked together in Big Four Consulting. I actually graduated with an engineering degree. And although I had offers from traditional sort of engineering firms, they didn't really excite me. So I went to the management school and I threw my resume in there, and that's how I landed in Big Four. So this is, I'll date myself, before the .com days, just as they were starting to get kind of going. So it was actually really interesting to be part of a consulting group that was starting to look at sort of what, e-commerce was going to look like, and then overlay security over that. So I spent about a dozen years in Big Four Consulting. I did both public and private sector. So it was great experience because you got to see so much. Multinational companies, small startups in the .com heyday, post-.com bust, recovering from that, because I think all of us have lived through that. And then eventually I came back to New York. So I went down to DC for a while, worked in the federal space, came back to New York, focused on finance because, you know, Wall Street. So you had a lot of finance customers there. You know, payments were going online. So it was always great experience. I spent most of my time similar to Alyssa with pen testing and red teaming, and then taking that and building on that to do kind of program development, governance processes, more regulatory, you know, legislation was coming out. So helping customers, you know, kind of address how to meet that need. Eventually I left consulting. I actually had 2 kids under the age of 2, and travel and 2 kids that young did not work well for where I was in my life. So I decided to move into industry, and being in New York, you know, it was easy for me, knowing finance as well as I did, to land in finance. Similar to, I think, what you've heard, lots of different work experiences in finance. I started in a sort of SOC, like an operations team, you know, basically managing a team, watching screens, raising incidents, managing incidents. And then moved to Citigroup, where I did tabletop exercises, but they were for like LATAM or Asia Pac. So what happens if there's fraud? How do the different regions in Asia Pac address it? What do you do for your call centers, customer service, which was really phenomenal, being able to work with the different business units within Citigroup. I was always fortunate to have a great team. So for me, it was always fun and easy. And then similar to Bandon, wanted to see a little bit of not finance, went into media. This is when GDPR was coming out. So that was really cool, going into an advertising firm when the first GDPR regulations were coming up in Europe, and trying to understand how, you know, data is just so nebulous. And let's be honest, like, knowing all your data is just near impossible. But I mean, you kind of have to with GDPR. So I was a CISO at Omnicom, and we started putting together strategies to address GDPR. And then also, like Alyssa, I came home. I had an opportunity to join Security Risk Advisors. I'd missed consulting. It's folks I had worked with in the past, so it was coming back to my friends, and coming back to cyber, and getting to go back into helping multiple customers.
Awesome. And Peter, let's hear about your career path.
Yeah, you made me go last here, and boy, do I feel old. My career starts a few years earlier than everybody else's. So wind the clock back to, say, 1981, when my mom walked in and saw me and my brother sitting on the couch doing nothing in the summer, and threw us out of the house and made us go take a computer programming class. That was it. Started me. I've been, you know, everything I've done has been revolved around that since then. When I was 19, I started working for a defense contractor, working on something called Unix, which nobody knew what that was. They said, that guy looks like he could work a computer. And I became a system administrator while I was in college. Back then, we were still fighting the commies. So I worked on a book called the Annual Report to the President and Congress on Soviet Military Power. This was before the Berlin Wall came down, and got to do a lot of interesting things. It was really the only place where security was a profession. You know, cybersecurity was a profession anywhere, right? I mean, there was a little bit of in banks at that point, but even there, it was still very rudimentary. And I did that for a few years, and then around, say, the mid-90s, I went into business with a couple of the folks I worked with on the military side, building a consulting company, doing technology consulting. There really wasn't, like I say, a discrete security business back then, so yeah, I predate the business. I like to say, you know, old school. I've been doing it since before it was cool. But yeah, so we didn't realize we were doing cybersecurity consulting, but we were. In the, say, 94, when the internet went commercial and anybody could connect to it, it wasn't just military and universities. The only folks who knew how to do it were, you know, folks like us who'd been doing it in those environments. So I actually met somebody the other day who went on a road trip with me in 1994 to try and sell firewalls up in Albany, New York, to the state of New York. So yeah, we were selling these firewalls that were sort of home brewed TIS toolkit things that you put together yourselves. And I did that. The company actually did fairly well. We actually went public right around the time of the dot-com, bubble, and then, like everybody else, we crashed and burned. And thankfully, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and my old military friends called and said, "Hey, we're getting the band back together." So I went again and did a bunch of security projects over there in the Middle East for a while, in the consulting capacity. As that wound down, I came back to the U.S. and I like to say I joined Big Four Consulting, PwC, and it was sort of like a halfway house because it was sort of like what I was doing there, but sort of like a real job. It's where I met Mamani and Bandon. We worked together. I was there about 6 years. I did all sorts of work: penetration testing, security assessments, SOX control work, internal audit work, which was fascinating for me. Somebody who hadn't had the experience to work in financial industry and in big businesses like that. You learn a lot of things when you work with the military, but it's sort of a totally different experience doing it in a professional environment. And that's why I call it sort of a halfway house, where I could spend a couple hours in front of the client and be the business professional and then go back and go, "Oh my God, what just happened?" And there were people I could ask to sort of translate it back to language I could understand. Don't ask Bandon to tell you any of those stories. The funniest part about that is, ironically, the three of us, I don't know how long you guys were there, but we all quit on exactly the same day. Went across the street to my cousin Owen's bar and drank for a few hours afterwards. Yeah, true story. And then I ended up leaving PwC. I went to work briefly in the internal audit team at Citigroup, auditing their cybersecurity and disaster recovery practices. And then went to the cybersecurity team at Citigroup, actually worked with Mamani again. For about 5 years, and then I took this role as CISO at Lazard, which has been a great experience. I've been here about 6 years. It was, sort of a greenfield opportunity, which has been great for me. They hadn't had a security practice before, and I've gotten to build out a global security practice at a fairly large global financial institution.
Awesome. So when I'm hearing the stories of your careers, I'm hearing technical and non-technical sort of skill development. But also, when you're talking about a finance career, you're also talking about learning various different regulations. There are regulations that impact you and don't impact you, or impact your customers or don't. So I just want to give sort of a snapshot as to your technical skill development, your non-technical skill development. Obviously, relationship development was really important. The three of you wouldn't still be friends, but also you have clients that you've had to develop their relationships. So, and then when did you start learning the regulations? So it sounds like it may have been a mosaic as you've been building it throughout your career, but I think people who are considering this as a career path sort of need to know what the technical, non-technical, and regulatory sort of goalposts are going to be throughout their career. Alyssa?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting, right? So because going back as far as I do in financial services, initially there weren't a whole lot of regulations, right? We had the FFIEC that we reported to, the FDIC, those types of organizations, government organizations that we had to report to, but there wasn't a lot else. And then slowly Visa started to, get a little more controlling. And then around 2006, right about the time I was jumping into security, is when, they brought together this PCI thing. And suddenly now it's like, okay, they're going to give this thing teeth, and we're actually going to have to do something about this. So that, that kind of took on a whole new world of its own. And then slowly, we started to see other government regulations. We had the big crash in 2008, which brought on a whole slew of new regulations for us. Even following 2001, though, I think back to even that, and there was, we got into things like OFAC regulations and stuff from the Patriot Act, and so it's kind of weird because, my progression in learning it, and I'm sure probably my peers here as well, it's very similar, is we actually grew up as a lot of these regulations were being formed. But now, stepping into S&P, it's different, right? Because a lot of these regulations exist, and I've moved from a lot of that banking-focused world to now, as a credit rating agency, we're dealing, and of course, being an organization that's involved in the markets, now it's dealing with organizations or regulators like the SEC and ESMA and MAS down in Singapore and others. So now it's not banking regulations, it's these other regulations. And when you've got, you're doing business in 138 different nations, you have to slowly kind of roll into that, right? There's not a way to say, I'm going to just dive in and know all these regulations. And it kind of comes up as you have to deal with them, right? I mean, some countries are more involved in it than others. I mean, I mentioned kind of the big three for us, the ones that we see most often. The FCA now is formed in the UK, and they're starting to become more hands-on. But there's other nations too, Hong Kong, South Africa, Russia. Those are all ones that I'm dealing with right now where maybe their regulators aren't as active, but they're starting to grow. So I think, where it comes to learning the regulations, it's a lot of it is just by necessity, right? It sort of comes up as you need it. And I know even in the consulting world, when I had to learn things like HIPAA and high trust and FERPA and all of these others, a lot of it just was you sort of gain that knowledge as you go. And I think hopefully that landscape has changed a bit as more people are getting into this space. There's maybe a little more proactive awareness of it because it's not so much that they're forming as you go. But I think still a lot of it is going to be just as you get into spaces where you need to know them, you sort of just find that time that, all right, this is something new I've got to learn.
Awesome. So, Bandon, can you touch a little bit on sort of the technical, non-technical career progression that you had? Sort of, was it all technical in the beginning? Was it non-technical at a certain part? And if you could touch on, which certifications you were really sort of going for.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about starting your career in consulting is that you get such a broad range of experiences. So one day we could be doing, a technical assessment, we might be doing a pen test, you might be doing some configuration assessments, and then the next day you might be working on some sort of like policy development effort. So I think for myself, I had a lot of back and forth between the technical and non-technical training, especially early on, and I think that consulting provided a very broad exposure. I would say, though, that very early on in my career, I was exposed to a lot of regulatory requirements. So we had a very large long-term project with a large international bank, and we were actually helping to build out some policy controls framework for them that kind of addressed all of these different regulations. So you had to really marry some of the technical understanding of how things worked and what was practical with what the regulations were asking for, which weren't always so prescriptive. And being able to pull those two components together was really important for me, at least. I think as I progressed through my career, though, it was back and forth as well. So, I left PwC in that consulting role, and I really moved more into kind of standing up security programs in this kind of greenfield fashion. So a lot of that was relationships and kind of working with other teams, especially as the organizations were smaller. They had less specialized teams. So there was a lot of relying on other teams and kind of leading through influence and trying to drive change with the understanding of how the technology operated and what the controls were, but really working with others in that kind of soft skill capacity to try to get that work done. And I think that's fairly consistent across organizations. It's just that when you're working at like a startup or something, you're much more resource constrained, so you have to really manage and prioritize the resources the best you can. So I would say that today, my skill sets have been leveraged on both sides. Like we as AWS, I get a very interesting view into financial services organizations. I work for a technology company, but the customers I support are within this financial services space. So in many ways, we're helping financial services customers really navigate the regulatory landscape, really trying to adapt their existing controls to meet the regulatory requirements when they're moving to the cloud. So it's really understanding the fundamentals, technologies, and practices of how you operate in a cloud native way when the regulations don't really keep up, right? They're not written for the current age. So a lot of the controls and a lot of the things that regulators come in and ask about, or even internal audit teams or external audit teams will come in and ask about, they don't line up with the current day practices. So part of that is kind of educating auditors and regulators, educating our customers on how you can meet objectives through new practices. So it's kind of managing relationships as well as kind of helping them understand underlying technical operations, which is really interesting in my mind.
And Peter, so, as you said, you sort of started way back when with this. How have you seen your progression between, technical and non-technical? And, it sounds like dealing with the regulations has been something that people have just had to dealt with as they've come up.
Yeah, and so for me, I've always had a technical base, right? That's what drew me to the field, and I enjoy it. It's where I'm most comfortable. I mentioned before I got thrown into that internal audit role at Citi, and the backstory there and is basically it was right in the middle of the financial crisis, right? And I don't know if anybody remembers that, but you couldn't buy a job in security during the financial, because the first thing everybody cut was yeah, we're not getting rid of all them security people. They're just a cost center. So I took a job in internal audit, and it was not in my comfort zone, right? It was terrible. I hated it, but it was a great experience because I got to see sort of the other side of that. When the auditors come in and they ask you these questions, they're not just doing it to be mean. I sort of understand what their logic is and what their motivations is, and it made me have to really focus on understanding what those regulations are so I could ask the right questions. Like Alyssa said, I was at Citigroup, which basically, in the same countries as S&P, whatever the number is, we're probably in just about all of them. And all of those regulators, they want to know what we're doing, about this and, cybersecurity, technology, business continuity. That was the big topic. Business continuity, and ironically, pandemic was the big topic because the avian flu had just come through. So all of those regulators came at us, and it was a great experience for me, somebody who was, I'll say, mostly technical to that point, to get thrown into that. And being forced to communicate with the written word in a way that was really meaningful, right? So these audit reports had huge impact on people's lives, right? This was, again, during the financial crisis. So if you wrote a negative audit report, that guy was probably going to be walked out to his car at the end of the day, right? I mean, it was that sort of tenuous everybody's existence, and being able to communicate a tough message in a way that was effective, but still made it so that you could, they wouldn't be waiting for you outside with a sock full of pennies, so that you could work with these people afterwards. I think those were the skills that I picked up doing that role. Hopefully they've carried forward a little bit, and in security, we obviously have to deliver a tough message a lot of times. I like to say, we're the guys in technology who have to call the baby ugly. It's just sort of what we do, and being able to tell somebody their baby's ugly but still have them go out for a beer with you, that's a skill that if you want to survive in this space, you kind of have to develop. So I'm glad I took that role, learned a little bit about regulations, and learned how to I guess a little bit better about how to do that.
Wonderful. So yeah, thanks. I haven't heard calling the baby ugly in a while, so I really love sort of the retro feel of, bringing up some of these terms. And I think people don't understand that the reason why we have so many great security professionals is because even before all of these attacks, there were other things that were going on. There were other global impact incidents that did impact our financial markets. It did impact sort of customer trust levels. So I think while we were all growing up in various different careers, we all had these challenges going on. So Mamani, you want to touch on a little bit sort of the technical and non-technical skill development that you've had to do?
Sure, and I think being in consulting, as Brendan mentioned, gives us a unique experience. Certainly started out, with the pen testing. I know when I moved back to New York, one of my first jobs was working for Peter for a telecom doing a pen test. So, but as Peter mentioned, you have to take that work and try to explain it to an audience that isn't in cyber necessarily. That could be an audit team. It could be, not the traditional cyber team. I think you've all heard, all of us have worked in fields where cyber wasn't as mature as maybe it is now in certain organizations. So you have to learn how to explain the impact, what it means, why you need to fix some of these things. And so you quickly understand how to understand what business you're working with. And I think in finance, relative to the regulatory, when some of those regulations came in, people kind of took notice, and I think it kind of helped us get that sort of acknowledgement, like, oh, so this is why, changing passwords matters, or, encrypting your data matters. So it's always been for me at least, start with the tech, but then being able to translate that and explain the so what of that tech to whatever audience you're with.
That's great. I mean, when I got my original degree in biochemistry, I wanted to work in the medical industry to just sort of say, I understand the tech, and being able to explain it to people who don't understand med tech. And it's interesting, I think that translates so well into so many different industries. You can be that technical expertise, but that additional skill of being able to translate it into layman's terms, being able to make it something that people can sort of digest and use. And that is something that we're seeing a lot in our industry, is being able to translate, give that information to sort of the C-suite so that they can make business strategy. And I think this is a translatable skill no matter where you go. You need to be able to be that person that can be the ambassador, the tech ambassador, or the tech liaison. And if you find that you're really good at storytelling, that this is definitely a role to think about. So we're opening up this sort of career field to people in our community that may not have ever looked at it. What are some of the challenges someone who is coming from, shall we say, not necessarily the outside, but a different industry? What are some of the things that you encountered coming into this industry that you would like to lay the path clear for other people coming into industry? What challenges should they be thinking about as they move forward? So Bandon, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I started my career consulting for this industry, so I'll give it kind of a different spin on it. I think leaving the industry for a while made me realize how different financial services is from a lot of the other industries that I was in. And I think some of the things that stuck out to me are just the heightened, I think, level of security because of conservatism due to these that they operate within. They have heightened regulations, they're dealing with people's money, there's like financial systems and transactions going on. So there's a lot of risk involved within the industry that doesn't necessarily translate to other industries. So because of that, when you're operating within financial services, I think the expectation is that you have much more tight controls and restrictions on what people can and cannot do. And that was really surprising to me leaving, because I just assumed that all industries were kind of operating the same way. And then working in other industries, I noticed that, things were a lot more lenient. There was a lot more like you could actually access things from your workstation, and you could check your email, and that was just blowing my mind, right? So I think people coming into the financial services industry, that's something that typically catches them off guard. And the other thing I would say is that we touched on the regulations, and I think that people talk about it, and maybe it's kind of intimidating to some people to think about like all the different regulations that they have coming into it. But I think that's a big difference between financial services and most other industries. There are some exceptions there, but the financial services industry, I think, is very complex from a regulatory standpoint. There's, I think Alyssa, you mentioned there's regional regulations in the different countries. There's, different regulators, and then within the United States, there's different regulators according to kind of like subsector as well. So it becomes a very complex industry when you look at it below like the financial services umbrella, right? There's like payments, there's insurance, there's capital markets, there's banking. So when you think about that, I think that is always kind of surprising when you don't realize until you're in the industry how different even the subsectors are between one another.
That's great. So Alyssa, what were some of the things that you see as challenges for people to come in? Because, when we talk about any regulated industry, as you pointed out earlier and Bandon touched on, there are different regional areas, but then, there's also subsectors. So what are some of the challenges that people should just be aware of when they come into this industry?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll speak to two of them that I've run into. First is, kind of to your direct question, Kathleen, in the financial sector in particular, there is a really significant understanding of risk, but that understanding of risk is so much larger and so much wider than you could possibly imagine from having worked in like other organizations. So working in healthcare, risk has kind of a narrow definition. Working in startups, if people even understand what risk really means, so a lot of times in those environments, you're the one kind of bringing that expertise. And when you get into the financial sector in particular, risk is such a strong topic and it has so many dynamics to it that a lot of times you're just one piece of a very large risk story. And so if you've come from another industry in particular, it takes some getting used to just realizing that, like, okay, I'm talking about risk in terms of cybersecurity, but there's a lot of other risk factors here that I don't even necessarily understand. And so, that's something that you really have to come in prepared to tackle that learning curve. The other thing I'll say, and this is more on the, I guess, the culture side of things, is quite bluntly, there's still a lot of financial services organizations that hold on to that boys club attitude and honestly that demographic, right? So being a woman in financial services can be kind of a challenge sometimes. So a lot of those things, I could speculate on 100 different reasons why that persists stronger in this particular industry than others, but it doesn't matter why. The fact of the matter is that is the case. And, a lot of the large organizations, the Citibanks, the S&Ps, the JP Morgans, a lot of the names that you recognize, they're making very concerted efforts to address that, but a lot of those just, those attitudes still persist, and it's something you have to be aware of and constantly working, to try to work against or to try to work around, as the case may be sometimes. So, I hate to paint that picture, but that is the reality if you're, non-male and looking to get into this particular very conservative space.
Great. So I'm just going to push it over to Mamani and sort of, what maybe you've experienced that same challenge. What other challenge should people from the outside experience or be prepared to experience?
Definitely echo what Alyssa said. Usually the only female and person of color in the room, especially in cyber. It just is what it is, but I would agree there are concerted efforts happening. And I think that I'll echo one other piece on culture. The culture is also very, I'll say collaboration isn't always the most upheld value. And that you kind of have to work through as well. Like building those relationships, building the trust is not trivial. And that's where the technical basis helped me gain that level of kind of credit, that, okay, she knows what she's talking about. But it's not, people aren't just instantly open. In other industries I've been in, or in like a startup type environment, you automatically have a level of togetherness and we're in it together. And I would say, building trust and a relationship in financial services takes a little bit more effort
and requires a little bit more work on establishing your credibility. The other thing I would say is the scale. Bandon alluded to the complexity of the business in and of itself. And it really is I won't even say that I truly understand all of financial services. And then you get into the types of financial services and products, whether it's consumer or, investment banking or insurance, they each have their own business model. Don't be daunted by that, but because it's also opportunity to, traverse within one of these, within the industry and work on different types of projects. But it is, the scale of financial services is pretty broad. There's a lot of different types of work that happens, and globally, right? Pretty much every financial service has some type of global footprint. So it can be daunting when you're first starting out, building those relationships and getting through the boys club. But at the same time, once you do that, you'll find yourself having a lot of opportunity to learn and experience some really cool things.
Wonderful. So Peter, I'm going to have you touch on this question and then kick off the final question, which is, so if you could address sort of a challenge someone should be aware of coming into this industry, and then move us into how does someone get into this industry and be successful? So career recommendations.
All right. So the challenge, I think we all sort of alluded to this. It's a really aggressive industry. People in this business, they're generally just outwardly aggressive. And me coming into it, I've been around a lot of government people, and government people tend to be passive aggressive. And that's one way. But no, this is in your face. What are you talking about? You are an idiot. Get out of my fucking office. That's a Tuesday in some places on Wall Street. It's just. And you kind of have to get past it. It's better. It's not nearly as bad as it was, say, in the 90s. I think we've all gotten better at culture and more tolerant and all of those things. But it's, as a few folks alluded to, that is still, sort of underlying a lot of this. I've gone into meetings where you could see people and they're holding all of that in while they're giving you, sort of more polite feedback. But, I think the other challenge is that the dollar values involved, right? So you go in there with a cybersecurity risk and you say, hey, listen, if we don't fix this, this could be a $10 billion hit in, this and that and that. The guy goes, it's a $40 million profit deal. If I don't do this deal, we definitely lose $40 million. You're saying I might lose 10 million if I, there's not, so it's a sort of different mindset because the numbers are so big quite often that you have to adjust to.
Wonderful. So I apologize. We're running out of money. I'm not running out of money. We're all talking about finance, and I'm thinking about money like you're talking about billions and millions of dollars here. So just some final career recommendations. Peter, you kick it off, and then Mamani, Bandon, and then Alyssa. So go. Final career recommendations. Yeah.
So I'm going to say don't be afraid. Go put yourself up for the role that you think you can do. Put yourself up for a role that you think is 2 steps ahead of what you think you can do. We need the help in the space. There's a ton of open recs. There's a ton of people that we need to fill. So I would say it's an aggressive industry. They will respect you more if you sort of go out and charge at these things aggressively. And don't be intimidated once you get here. And if somebody does get in your face, get right back in their face.
Being a New Yorker. Bandon, what about you? What are your final career recommendations?
I would agree with Peter in that there's a lot of opportunity and recs open in the space. And for people who are trying to get into finance, I'm a little biased here, but I think that all of the firms that we talk to are thinking about the cloud. And it's very likely that if you're working in other industries in security, you have as much or probably more experience than many of the people with cloud security. So they're definitely looking for people with those skill sets. And if that's an interesting place for you in terms of capability and you want to get into the industry, I think that's a really nice way to pivot into financial services firms.
Mamani?
I would say ask for forgiveness instead of permission. To Peter's aggressiveness, just don't trust yourself. Go do what you think needs to get done, and ask for permission later.
Great. Alyssa, wrap us up.
All right, I'm going to go a completely different route, and I'm going to say get paid. Literally, and this is probably because I'm giving a talk on that at DEF CON Career Village, but literally get paid. As was mentioned, this is a conservative industry. They're financially very fiscally conservative, right? And they are going to, when you're in that job offer stage and you're negotiating your job offer, they will push back on you. But don't be afraid to, know what you're worth and push for it, because at the end of the day, as Brandon mentioned, there's a desperate need in this space for cybersecurity talent. And these organizations, although they won't let on to you in that job search that they're paying top dollar to get you. So know what that position is that you're walking into, what it is worth, and make sure you get yourself paid, because if you're underpaid, you're not going to enjoy working in this industry. I can promise you that.
Great wrap up. Well, Brandon, Mamani, Peter, and Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for sharing with us your career paths and why it's so important and interesting to go into the finance information security. Thank you, everyone. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for the Finance Security Career Panel. One of the things that we like to do here at Higher Ground is really make sure that we open up everyone's eyes to the variety of career paths that are out there. So I'm really thankful that our career panelists have joined us this evening on Sunday. We've had a great time here in the green room, sort of sharing our career paths and our backgrounds and what we're drinking. And one of the questions that came through on Discord was, if you're in a finance security career already, how do you move from sort of mid-level to sort of pushing yourself up, understanding that, when you've established yourself in a career, then it's moving to that next level. How do you take that risk? How do you evaluate the risk moving to the next level? So Peter, as our longtime career coach here, why don't you kick this off, and then we'll move to Mamani, Alyssa, and then Brandon.
Sure. So I think the first thing is sort of pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. I think we all, as we move to that mid-level of our career, we find sort of comfortable grooves that we can get stuck in. And I think you have to challenge yourself to sort of push beyond that. Make yourself get noticed by kind of the extra assignments you're taking on. And most of the people I've talked to, the mistake they make is that they don't give themselves enough credit. They think that that's a role I couldn't take, or that's an assignment I couldn't complete. You're probably capable of a lot more than you think you are, and you should err on the side of being bold, and that's how you move forward. I mean, and you want to work for an organization that's going to tolerate you being imperfect, because everybody's imperfect and you're going to make mistakes along that journey, but don't let that stop you.
Mamani?
I would also say don't focus just on the kind of group you are in. Look outside that team. I mean, you can stay within cyber, but even if you're comfortable in one role, push yourself to try a different role that's at that higher level. And another point I would say is build relationships outside of your team. Get other folks to know who you are, know what you're capable of, get exposure outside of your group, and put yourself out there. And as others notice, your name's just going to float to the top.
Great. Alyssa?
Yeah, a lot of what I was going to say kind of mirrors that, and that is, the more that you show that you can bring together the other areas of the business and unite and work across those lines, that's something that really establishes you as a leader. And then, to that end, it's really about understanding the business. That's how you're going to do that. And that's also what, as you broaden and start to work with other areas, just showing that you really understand the business side of things and can apply what you're trying to do from a security perspective into that broader scope and bring those teams together, those are the kinds of things that are going to ultimately get you, on that list, if you will. It's a horrible way to put it, but for that next leadership opportunity.
Brandon?
Yeah, I would agree with what everyone has said before. The only thing I'd add, though, is just don't be afraid to be a little self-promoting, right? It doesn't have to be a boast fest, but just make sure you are able to highlight your accomplishments and just make it known to people that you actually are looking for that next step in your career, because people aren't necessarily going to just do that for you.
So the one thing I want to add in here in any career is to look at that there's a difference between a mentor and a sponsor. So a mentor is someone that you're going to meet with, who's going to be able to answer questions, sort of help you think things through. A sponsor, and this is not a financial relationship, but this is a person that is at a senior level who has taken an interest in you because you have proven yourself to them, and they are going to advocate for you to be moved up the chain. So it's understanding that there are those two roles and finding out who they are. Now, it is not like the military where there's, insignia that tells you who is what, but building your network is a way to do that. We've had a question in Discord from sort of someone who's in the beginning of their career, who's done a lot of security profession, but they want to know, do they need to have finance or economics? Should they take those courses to move into finance security? So Mamani, do you want to kick it off? Alyssa,
Sure.
Brandon, and then Peter?
Sure. I'll start by saying I had none. And I went to engineering school. We made fun of the business majors. It's a thing. Don't ask. But I will say, to Alyssa's point, because I started out in Big Four consulting, one of the first kind of tenets is understand your customer, understand the business, because you can't solve problems unless you know what the real, problem they're trying to solve is. So I think the nature of whether you're in InfoSec or not, no matter where you are, you do want to try to understand that business. I think it's totally fine to learn on the job. I certainly did in different industries. I think it does help to talk to people within that are not in InfoSec, that might be in like the investment side or the customer side. But you can learn on the job, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's not much to add to that really, other than, you asked two questions. I don't know if you realized it, Kathleen. Do you have to have it? No. Should you? Perhaps it will help, but also understand that bringing a little bit different perspective can be just as valuable as coming in, as somebody with a business degree.
Brandon?
Yeah, I think understanding the business will definitely help. So totally agree. You can learn on the job. I didn't have any real direct firsthand experience with finance going into my first finance security career. But I think understanding the context and how the business makes money and where the business process flows are, where the data is, will only help make you better. Similar to every other industry, but I think in finance, it's very particular because there's a lot of very structured business flows and transaction flows that you should be aware of.
So, Peter, I'm going to delve into our next question with you. So a lot of questions are coming up in Discord about regulation compliance and understanding regulation compliance and how that impacts your career. So how do you navigate that?
So I think I'm going to tie back to the last question. And I think as you move forward in your career, understanding the business becomes more and more important, right? If you're a SOC analyst who's looking at, is this malware or is this not malware? The fact that you understand the, financial transaction, or you can quote the Black-Scholes equation to determine futures, it doesn't matter, right? It's not important. But as you move forward and you want to be seen as a business leader who's making security decisions to forward the objectives of the business, you actually have to understand those objectives of the business, and you have to be able to speak the language of the people who decide on those objectives. So I think, like I said, the further you go in your career, the higher up you want to move in that ladder, the more it becomes important. And I think the regulations tie into that, where the regulatory requirements get pretty complex with finance, right? And in one of my previous employers, we used to like to say that we are far more regulated as a bank than somebody is who runs a nuclear power plant, right? And that's an enormous amount of things you have to understand. And again, the further you get in your career and the more, the higher up the ladder you go, the more important that gets, right? Again, if you're at that, is this malware, is it not malware level, it probably doesn't matter that much. But if you're trying to explain to the CEO why he needs to spend this money to mitigate these risks, understanding those complexities become more and more important.
So we only have a few seconds left. I want to have each one of you give sort of your parting thoughts for why people should consider this career. So Alyssa, do you want to start off? Then Mamani, Bandon, and Peter.
I mean, it's a very stable market that's not going to go anywhere, right? I mean, we are going to have money and deal with markets and things like that as long as there are humans on this planet. So you might as well, if you're looking for, if security wasn't stable enough, financial services in security makes it even more stable.
Mamani?
Sure. I'll say most financial services tend to have some level of international or at least multinational aspects to it. So if that's something you're interested in, there is opportunity to, travel and see different pieces of the business around the world. So another pro.
Bandon?
I think working in financial services, you really do get to see a lot of really interesting things, right? You're seeing all sorts of threats out there from, undirected kind of opportunistic threats to really advanced nation state actors. So I think that breadth of challenge is really interesting that you don't necessarily get in other industries.
And Peter, wrap us up.
Yeah, so I think Alyssa mentioned this while we were recording the panel. Like Willie Sutton said, this is where they keep the money. So that is probably everyone's number one reason to get into finance. But I think that also inspires a tremendous amount of attacker behavior, and you get to see things in this industry that you won't see anywhere else. It's also the most mature by far of any of the verticals out there. So if you really want to test your skills, this is the place to do it.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of you. I mean, it's amazing that we're able to do this virtually. I'm so pleased that we were able to bring this panel together. And I thank you all for your time on a Sunday afternoon when I know we have so many family and professional obligations. Thank you so much. And if you want to continue the discussion in the Discord, please feel free. Thank you. Bye-bye.